Hey, you're back. Welcome to Season 2 of The People We Meet. My name is Ty Brunner, and I'll be your host. This is a show about ordinary people that have done extraordinary things. I'm glad you're here, and let's get on with it. Hello, and welcome to another episode of The People We Meet. Today I don't have a guest. I just have my little history book. So stick with me and hop into the Wayback Machine, and let's take a trip. And when we get back, you may not agree with me, but we will have made some interesting stops. I want you to picture something. Not today's headlines, not the noise, just a harbor. Cold air, a little fog, and off in the distance, the Statue of Liberty, holding a torch over a nation that was still young enough to believe its own promises. Imagine boats rolling in by the hundreds, families in threadbare clothes, mothers holding kids who hadn't had a real meal in weeks, and fathers carrying every ounce of hope they ever had in a single bag. They weren't invaders. They weren't criminals. They were human beings doing what human beings have always done when the ground under their feet turned to shit. They moved. And at the end of that long, uncertain journey, there was a poem waiting for them. Not a political slogan or a campaign ad. It was a promise. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. The wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door. Now, I had to go look that up because I didn't know what tempest-tossed meant. Because it sounds like something you'd order at a pirate-themed gastropub. But what it really means is people who have been wrecked by life storms. War, famine, violence, persecution, people who got their asses kicked, but life kept going anyway. Now, a plaque doesn't say, give me your high score credit applicants. It doesn't say, give me your English-speaking, economically convenient immigrants. It says, give me the people that nobody else wants. Now, between 1892 and 1954, over 12 million immigrants came through Ellis Island. 12 million people carrying everything they owned in bags small enough to hold against their chest. They weren't arriving as doctors and CEOs. They were arriving hungry, exhausted, sick, and desperate. And nearly every one of them shared the same thought. Maybe things will be better over here. Those people didn't weaken the country. They built it. And the plaque at the base of the Statue of Liberty wasn't poetry for poetry's sake. It was a statement of intent, a line in the sand about who we thought we were trying to be. Now, the trouble is, symbols are easy to love. Living up to them is harder. And somewhere along the way, a lot of us started treating that plaque like decor, something we admire, quote when it's convenient, and quietly ignore when the world gets messy. We'll fly the flags, slap the stickers on the trucks, talk about American values like they are indestructible, and never stop to ask whether we're actually practicing the ones we inherited. That's not an insult. That's human nature. Now, before anybody hears what I did come up with and thinks that I think there should be no rules, let's get something straight. There has always been a process. My own ancestors didn't just waltz on in and set up shop. They were questioned, examined, and sometimes turned away. Ellis Island wasn't a free-for-all. It was a bureaucracy, clipboards, and hard decisions. The difference today is that the system is far more complex, slower, and more tangled than most Americans realize. Not by opinion, but by math and paperwork. And yeah, dealing with people who are here without legal status is a real problem, and pretending otherwise helps no one. But problems still require proportionate solutions. Which brings me to an analogy, because they're useful and they're fun, and because I didn't spend 30 years in the fire service without learning how to draw some colorful comparisons. So let's say we've got a room and contents fire. One room's burning because little Johnny was playing with a lighter again. It happens. So we roll in, force entry, ventilate, put water on the fire, and yep, all of that can do a hell of a lot of damage if you don't know what you're doing. But the goal isn't to look aggressive. The goal is to be precise. We calculate flow paths. We coordinate ventilation with fire attack. We put water where it actually needs to go. fast enough to stop the spread, controlled enough to protect the rest of the house, the people inside it, and everything that can be saved. And I'll tell you this much, nobody from the Fightin' 15s, my crew, ever stood out on the front lawn congratulating themselves because we solved a room and contents fire by leveling the rest of the house. And that's the point. Big problems don't justify indiscriminate solutions. They demand targeted ones. And that brings us to history. Because history isn't nostalgia. It's not trivia. History is a warning label, and it only matters if we read it, not rip it off because it isn't flattering, and history doesn't give a fuck. History is honey badger. It just is. This is why we need to tighten up a word that gets thrown around way too loosely these days. Patriotism. I like to think that we're all patriots, that we love our country, we would fight for our country, and work together to make our country better. It seems like I've heard that word a lot lately, but not necessarily in the sense that I believe it was intended. So for the sake of this talk, I think it's important to offer up a working definition of just what that means. Patriotism is not nationalism. Patriotism is loving your country enough to tell the truth, even when that truth isn't dressed up prettily in gleaming ramparts. Nationalism is loving a fantasy version of your country that never did anything wrong. One is rooted in responsibility, and the other is rooted in denial. A country this big, this loud, this ambitious didn't get where it is without fucking up a few things along the way. And that's not weakness, that's reality. Growth without mistakes is a fairy tale. And between you, me, and the other 9 people listening to this show, I've learned a hell of a lot more from the things that I fucked up than anything that I ever accidentally got right. So instead of shouting about the present, I'm going to pull out my little history book. Let's call this one The Trouble with Those Pesky Immigrants, and walk through the past. Not to shame anyone or to score points, but because we're all patriots. Let's start with the Irish. Chapter 1. The Irish are going to ruin everything. Let's rewind to the 1840s. Ireland collapses under the weight of famine. Not tight times, not a rough harvest. People are literally starving to death. Bodies in ditches, families selling the last spoon in the house for a loaf of bread. So they come here, by the tens of thousands, packed into ships so filthy and overcrowded they earn the charming nickname coffin ships, which tells you pretty much everything you need to know about the travel experience. And when they finally reached American shores, they're sick, malnourished, traumatized, and hopeful that things will be better over here. And America looks at them and says, absolutely not. They are disease-ridden drunks. They are lazy. They're accused of being violent, warned they'll never assimilate, and this one's my favorite. Informed they're not really white. Yep, let that one sink in. Employers hang signs in their windows that read, "No Irish need apply." Newspapers warn the Irish are breeding too fast, overrunning our cities, and stealing American jobs. Politicians insist that they're loyal to the Pope, as if the Vatican had a master plan to overthrow Boston via underpaid dock workers buzzed on Irish whiskey. And because America never half-asses a panic, we build an entire political movement around it. Meet the Know-Nothing Party. Now, I don't remember learning about this group in school, so I had to go look them up. And honestly, these fucking guys really take the cake. The Know-Nothings weren't accidentally ignorant. They were deliberately ignorant. Their whole brand was refusing to learn, refusing to listen, and refusing to know anything beyond what confirmed their fear. They wore their ignorance like a badge of honor. Meetings were secret, answers were scripted, and when asked about policy, members were instructed to respond, "I know nothing." And that wasn't a joke. That was the point. They rejected experts, mocked education, treated facts like threats and curiosity like treason. And they built a political identity around the idea that the country was safer if nobody knew too much. Their platform was simple: restrict immigration, delay citizenship, protect American culture. And here's the part where history quietly clears its throat. Everything that Know-Nothings said about the Irish turned out to be dead wrong. The drunks, They became cops and firefighters. The criminals, they built unions and cities. And the unassimilable outsiders became teachers, mayors, senators, and hell, even presidents. And which president? That would be one John F. Kennedy, Irish Catholic on both sides of the family. The people America was terrified of ended up holding the country together. The fear felt reasonable at the time. The policies felt necessary. And hindsight later called bullshit, which raises an uncomfortable question we never seem eager to ask. If the loudest voices were that wrong then, what makes us so confident that they're right now? And we're just getting warmed up. Chapter 2. The Chinese are stealing our jobs. Now we roll into the mid to late 1800s. The Industrial Revolution is revved up to full throttle. America is expanding west, building railroads, digging mines, ripping steel and timber out of the ground like it's in a hurry to become a superpower. And none of that happens without labor. A lot of it. The kind of labor that breaks bodies. So who does the work that nobody else wants? Chinese immigrants. They blast tunnels through granite. They lay track across mountains, and they hang in baskets over cliffs with explosives and hand tools. They work longer hours, for less pay, under more dangerous conditions than almost anyone else on the payroll. And they don't bitch. Not because it's easy, but because survival doesn't leave room for whining. And for a while, America is perfectly happy to have them. Right up until it isn't. Things kind of went to shit. And the why is important. In the years leading up to this, the country went all in on railroad expansion. Miles of track were laid faster than the economy could justify, financed by massive speculation and easy credit. Railroads were overbuilt, wildly over-leveraged, and propped up by shaky investments. Then, in 1873, that bubble popped. One of the biggest railroad financiers in the country collapsed. Banks failed, credit froze, and the economy slid into what historians now call the Long Depression. Jobs disappeared, wages cratered, working people got crushed. But here's the key part. The people who caused it, the financiers, the speculators, and corporate decision makers who overextended the system and walked away insulated were never even seriously blamed, much less held accountable. It was far easier to point down the ladder than up it. So instead of asking why reckless expansion and bad management tanked the economy, the country asked a much simpler question. Who's closest and different enough to blame? And that's how the Chinese workers, the same people who had just finished building the railroads, suddenly became the villains of a crisis they didn't create. Suddenly, the headlines change. Chinese workers are accused of taking jobs, lowering wages, refusing to assimilate, being diseased, being dangerous, being un-American. Newspapers describe them as a yellow peril. Politicians warned of a flood that will overwhelm American culture. And cartoonists draw them as vermin, caricatures, and invaders. And my personal favorite bit of historical bullshit, the claim that Chinese men were luring white women into opium dens. Because apparently, white women in the 1870s were hapless little woodland creatures wandering into trapdoors by accident. As always, fear needed a story and logic was not invited. Meanwhile, the truth was right there in plain sight. Chinese laborers weren't stealing jobs. They were doing the jobs that other people wouldn't, and doing them well. They weren't driving wages down either. That honor belongs to the employers who happily paid immigrants less, pocketed the difference, and then pointed at the workers and said, "See, there's your problem." It was economic misdirection. Fuck everyone involved, then blame the people with the least power. And because America has a habit of turning panic into policy, we took the next step. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. Now, this was a big one. America's first federal law banning immigration based on nationality. Not behavior, not criminal history, nationality. The law barred Chinese laborers from entering the country, made it nearly impossible for those already here to bring their families, and told an entire group of people, "Hey, thanks for building the country. Now get the fuck out." Now let that sit for a second. We let them build the spine of the nation, and then we slammed the door and kept the bones. And here's the part that history refuses to stop repeating. Every accusation hurled against the immigrants in the 1880s shows up again later with different faces and fresher fonts. They're taking jobs. They're lowering wages. They don't belong here. They'll never assimilate. They're a threat, and blah, blah, blah. Same script, different century. And just like before, banning the Chinese didn't magically fix anything. Wages didn't rise. Jobs didn't flood back. Economic anxiety didn't disappear. All that changed was who we blamed next. Because scapegoats are easier than solutions, and fear is cheaper than reform. The Chinese weren't a threat to America. They were a part of building it, literally. But history has a cruel sense of humor. When we punish the people who show up to work and let the people who profit off the chaos keep their seats at the table, which brings us to the next chapter. Because once you've decided immigrants are the problem, it's only a matter of time before you start looking for the new kind. And trust me, we found one. Chapter 3. The Italians and Jews are criminals, degenerates, and not white enough. By the late 1800s and early 1900s, America is booming. Cities are exploding. Factories are roaring. The country is swallowing labor like it's running on fumes. And into that machine comes a massive wave of immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe, Italians, Jews, Poles, Russians, and Slavs. Most of them are poor. Many of them are terrified. And a lot of them are running for their lives. Now, the word pogrom came up in my reading, and I thought, I don't know what that means, but it sounds pretty bad. So I looked it up. A pogrom was a government-sanctioned assault on Jewish communities, a violent free-for-all where mobs were allowed and often encouraged to terrorize families. Homes burned, businesses looted, women assaulted, men beaten or murdered in the streets, and children dragged into the chaos. And police stood by, or worse, joined in. This wasn't random violence. This was a message that said, you are disposable. That's what people were fleeing when they boarded ships to America. And they showed up on our shores thinking, maybe this is where things finally get better. And how do we greet them? By calling them criminals, degenerates, diseased, unfit, and my personal favorite, racially inferior. Yep, white Americans in 1900 thought that Italians and Jews weren't white enough. Now wrap your head around that horse shit. This wasn't whispered in back rooms. It was printed in newspapers, debated in legislatures, and taught as fact. Politicians warned about Mediterranean blood. Academics fretted over Hebrew traits. Officials insisted Southern and Eastern Europeans would dilute the nation, weaken democracy, and drag America backwards. And because naked bigotry loves a lab coat, we dressed it up as science. And that science was called phrenology, a $5 word for less than a nickel's worth of bullshit. Phrenology was presented as a legitimate science. The idea that a person's intelligence, morality, criminal tendencies, and fitness for citizenship could be determined by the shape of their skull. It wasn't science. It was racism in a lab coat. There was no empirical evidence, no reproducible results, no biological basis. The conclusions always seemed to line up perfectly with whatever prejudices the examiner already believed. Southern and Eastern Europeans, inferior skull structure. Africans, predisposed to criminality. Irish, emotionally unstable. Jews, cunning, untrustworthy, and overly intellectual. Funny how the calipers never contradicted the social hierarchy of the day. Fun story. When I was in the Marine Corps, we had a guy in my platoon whose head was shaped like a football, so we called him Spalding. Now, according to phrenology, this guy should have been a disaster. And in reality, he was the smartest guy in the whole platoon, by a mile. He went on to military intelligence and would have given the phrenology crowd a stroke. Which is kind of the point. Skull shape didn't predict intelligence back then, and it doesn't now. It was never a science. It was just a permission slip for people to believe what they already wanted to believe. And while politicians and newspapers screamed that Italian and Jewish immigrants were destroying America, the real criminals weren't living in tenements. They were sitting in boardrooms, running monopolies, bribing lawmakers, busting unions, and rewriting laws to keep themselves rich. But sure, let's focus on the guy sewing shirts for pennies. The panic crescendoed into a full symphony of stupidity. Italians are forming gangs. Jews are taking over businesses. Eastern Europeans are anarchists. They'll destroy democracy. And once again, fear graduated into policy. The Immigration Act of 1924, also known as the Johnson-Reed Act. Now, this law slammed the brakes on immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe using quotas explicitly designed to keep America pure. This wasn't coded language. Lawmakers said out loud that some Europeans were less intelligent, less desirable, and less American than others. And here's a fact that should make everybody's butthole clench just a little. The Nazis studied this law when designing their own racial policies. And you know what those fuckers thought. That's how respectable this thinking had become. But history, stubborn as ever, had other plans. The Italians America feared became cops, soldiers, chefs, builders, artists, governors, and one very loud New York mayor. Fiorello LaGuardia, half Italian, half Jewish, 5'0" and louder than a subway train. He ran New York through the Great Depression and World War II with competence and ferocity. They even named an airport after him. You might have even flown into it. Fiorello, all 5'2" of him, stood up proud and tall and gave the immigration doomsayers the finger. So much for the violent degenerate. The Jews, who were supposedly incapable of assimilation, became scientists, doctors, musicians, comedians, writers, entrepreneurs, shaping American medicine, culture, science, and innovation in ways we literally cannot imagine life without. Check out some of the names on the roster. Jonas Salk, Robert Oppenheimer, George Gershwin, Mel Brooks, Gene Wilder, Barbra Streisand, Isaac Asimov. Everything we said would destroy America ended up enriching it. Fear makes people stupid. Fear makes people cruel. And fear makes people forget that the outsiders of one generation almost always become the real Americans of the next. We didn't just get this chapter wrong. We documented it, defended it, legislated it, and apologized decades later once the damage was already done. Then we picked a new target and we did it again. This chapter is an ancient history. It's a case study. And it brings us to the next group, because once fear becomes policy, the list never stops growing. Chapter 4, Mexicans and the Politics of Doing Something. Now we hit the 1930s, the Great Depression. Now this wasn't some mystery. It was a pileup of elite failures. Wall Street speculation and unregulated banking wiped out savings. The Smoot-Hawley tariff strangled trade and turned a recession into a global collapse. Government inaction, no safety nets, no deposit insurance, no unemployment support, let the damage spread unchecked. Those were policy decisions made by people in power. But instead of owning them, leaders redirected the anger downward, toward Mexican workers who had nothing to do with stock market crashes, trade wars, or bank failures. It was easier to deport people than to regulate banks or admit the system had been mismanaged from the top. And here's the part that matters. We didn't just target Mexican immigrants. We targeted Mexican Americans, including U.S. citizens. Between 1929 and 1939, local, state, and federal authorities pushed what they called Mexican repatriation. Now, that word sounds very polite, but it wasn't. There were workplace raids, neighborhood sweeps, families pressured or forced to leave with little warning and almost no due process. A significant number of those removed were U.S. citizens, not because they'd done anything wrong, but because they fit a profile. And no, it didn't work. The Depression didn't end because families were shoved onto trains and buses. What it did do was create the appearance of action. And that's the trap. Because when people are scared, doing something can feel more satisfying than doing the right thing or the effective thing. And that's not problem solving. That's damage with applause. That's standing on the front lawn of a house fire and cheering because something got broken. That's how enforcement turns into sweeps. That's how policy turns into collective punishment. And that's how you end up deporting your own citizens. And that brings us to the next chapter, Now, this is the one where fear didn't just bend the law. It made the Constitution sit down and shut up. Chapter 5. Japanese Americans must be spies. By the 1940s, the pattern should feel familiar. There's a national shock, fear looking for a target. December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor. The country is rattled, shock turns to rage turns to suspicion, and suspicion asks the oldest question in American history. Who can we blame? And almost immediately, suspicion lands on Japanese Americans. Not because of evidence, not because of behavior, because of ancestry. And here's the part that often gets skipped. The U.S. government already knew Japanese Americans were not a threat before the camps, before the barbed wire. The intelligence was clear. In 1941, the State Department commissioned the Munson Report, and its conclusion was blunt. Japanese Americans posed no significant risk of sabotage or espionage. They were overwhelmingly loyal, law-abiding, and deeply rooted in their communities. In 1942, the Navy's intelligence arm produced the Ringel Report, reaching the same conclusion. No evidence of coordinated spying. No justification for mass removal. Even J. Edgar Hoover, hardly a civil liberties crusader, told the White House that sweeping action was unnecessary. If there were individuals of concern, law enforcement already knew who they were. Let's be precise. This was not a decision made in ignorance. It was a decision made despite the facts. So meet General John DeWitt. General John DeWitt, head of the Western Defense Command, didn't just ignore the intelligence. He rejected the idea that evidence mattered at all. His view was simple. A Jap's a Jap. Citizenship didn't matter. Loyalty didn't matter. Individual behavior didn't matter. Race was the whole case. And when critics pointed out that there had been no acts of sabotage by Japanese Americans, DeWitt offered a piece of logic so twisted, it still chills the page. He said, "The absence of sabotage is the best evidence that sabotage is contemplated." Read that again. In this framework, innocence was proof of guilt. Normal life became camouflage. Obedience became suspicious. There was no way to be cleared. This wasn't fear talking off the cuff. This was fear promoted to policy. This led to Executive Order 9066. On February 19, 1942, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066. The language was vague, bureaucratic, and carefully sanitized. In practice, it meant this. The government could remove anyone it chose from designated areas without charges, without trials, and without evidence. That power was aimed almost immediately in one direction. Japanese Americans were given days, sometimes hours, to prepare. One suitcase, one duffel bag, a life reduced to what you could carry. Homes were abandoned, farms sold for pennies, businesses quietly vanished, pets were left behind, and communities were hollowed out. And then came the camps. Now let's be adult about this. These were not relocation centers. They were prisons. Barbed wire, guard towers, armed soldiers, barracks in deserts and swamps, dust, heat, cold. More than 120,000 people were incarcerated, and about 2/3 of those were U.S. citizens. Their crime wasn't espionage. It was heritage. And then came the legal failure in all this. In 1944, the Supreme Court upheld the internment in Korematsu versus the United States, ruling that national security justified the mass removal of an entire ethnic group. Decades later, the government admitted the truth. The internment was driven by race prejudice, war hysteria, and a failure of political leadership. Reparations were paid, apologies were issued, and all of them arrived after the damage was done. And the result? No spy rings uncovered, no sabotage plots foiled, no threats neutralized. Because there were none. The camps didn't make America safer. They proved how fragile rights become when ancestry is treated as evidence and just in case becomes a justification. This chapter matters not because it was unique, but because it was legal, popular, and defended by politicians, court, and much of the public. Once a country decides that who you are is proof enough, that line doesn't uncross easily. here's the last history lesson. This is called When Fear Learned to Wear a Tie. Because up to this point, the fear we talked about had a face. The Irish, the Chinese, Southern and Eastern Europeans, Mexicans, Japanese Americans, groups you could point at, mark, round up. After World War II, something changed. For the first time, the enemy wasn't visible. It was ideological. Enter the Cold War, when suspicion became policy. The Soviet threat was real. Espionage happened. Nuclear annihilation wasn't a metaphor, it was a clock on the wall. But instead of responding with precision, we reached for something familiar. Suspicion. McCarthyism didn't look like mobs or riots. It looked like paperwork, loyalty oaths, blacklists, investigations, and hearings. You didn't have to be guilty. You just had to be adjacent, insufficiently enthusiastic, connected to the wrong person at the wrong time. Careers were destroyed, not for what people did, but for who they knew. This wasn't fear overthrowing democracy. It was fear operating inside of it. Very few actual spies were caught. Plenty of innocent lives were dismantled. And later, once again, we admitted what we had overreacted. Now let's talk about 9/11 for a second, when the fear was real. September 11th. This time, fear wasn't abstract. It wasn't hypothetical. It hurt. We were attacked on our soil in real time. And for a moment, we became one country again. And that matters. But fear still does what fear does. Very quickly, suspicion narrowed its focus. Muslims, Arabs, South Asians, anyone who looked foreign enough. I'll admit, I wasn't immune. I remember stepping onto planes and scanning faces, quietly deciding who I thought might be dangerous, wondering if somebody was going to come at me with a box cutter. And I hate admitting that, but it's true. And then one guy tried to light his shoes on fire, and I get to take my Skechers off in every airport in America for the next 25 years. That's how fear works. It makes ridiculous things feel reasonable. Some changes made sense, and some didn't, and a lot of them stuck around long after fear should have cooled. Once again, we adjusted the balance between security and liberty, and only later stopped to ask how far we'd gone. Why does this matter? This is where I stop piling on examples, because the point's already been made. Fear doesn't disappear, it evolves. Sometimes it targets race, sometimes ideology, sometimes religion, sometimes whoever's closest when the panic strikes. And the more respectable it becomes, wrapped in law, procedure, and authority, the easier it is to convince ourselves we're being rational when we're really just reacting. You don't need camps to violate rights. You don't need mobs. You don't need violence. All you need is permission and a public willing to confuse suspicion with proof. So what was the point of all this? I got asked a fair question after an early draft. Okay, so what are you actually trying to do here? He said, I hear a lot of bitching, but I don't hear a lot of solutions. Am I proposing legislation, running for office, or drafting immigration policy? I'm not. I'm not a senator. I'm not an attorney. I'm not a governing official. I'm a podcaster. But I am one of we the people. And if we're going to keep saying those words, and if we're going to keep wrapping ourselves in them, then we owe them more than slogans and selective memory. And this is the point. A lot of the history we just walked through was never taught, or was taught so softly it barely registered. We learned dates, not consequences, events, but not patterns, outcomes, but not costs. And when you don't know the pattern, every new crisis feels unprecedented. Every new group feels uniquely dangerous. Every overreaction feels justified. So what does history ask of us? It's not here to shame us. It's here to steady us. It teaches us to slow down, and to separate real threats from familiar scapegoats, to tell the difference between precision and panic, to ask whether a solution actually solves a problem or just satisfies anxiety. Now, I'm not here to hand out policy prescriptions. That's not my lane. I'm here to say that if we the people still means anything, then we have a responsibility to know what that phrase has cost and what it demands when things get hard. History doesn't ask us to be perfect, but it does ask us to be honest. Honest about who we've been. Honest about when human nature got the better of us. and honest about whether we're solving real problems or just repeating old reflexes with new targets. This episode wasn't about telling you what to think. It was just about reminding you what's already happened and why it still matters. Because honestly, there isn't much happening right now that hasn't happened before. And in the next episode, I'm bringing in somebody who actually works inside the immigration system, an immigration attorney. We'll talk about what the process really looks like, why it's so difficult, and what gets lost when the conversation is driven by noise instead of facts. That conversation needs context. And this was it. Because if we the people still means anything at all, it starts with knowing the whole story, not just the parts that make us comfortable. Now, before I wrap this up, I should say that this didn't come out of thin air. A few smart friends, my unofficial Knights of the Round Table, listened to my drafts, poked holes, and told me when I was getting a little too far up my own ass. And my wife deserves some credit for listening to this thing multiple times, though the credit is reduced for heckling and eye-rolling. So if this episode landed at all, it's because other people helped me sand the rough edges. Thanks for listening. Well, that'll about do it for this episode of The People We Meet. I'd like to take a few seconds for some shout-outs. First, to my main man, J-Mac, at Studio 42 Recordings for his audio prowess. Second, to my family for putting up with my recording shit scattered all over the dining room table and for stopping to talk to random strangers wherever we go. And last, to my listeners. This isn't a big show, so it means a lot to me when somebody rolls up to me and says, "Hey man, when are you going to have out some more shows?" So if you know someone who has a story that just has to be told, drop me a line at thepeoplewemeetpodcast.com. I'd love to hear from you. Thanks again for listening, and I'll catch you next time.